I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Bradley Birzer. Brad holds the Russell Kirk Chair in History at Hillsdale College, where he was twice recognized as Professor of the Year. He is also a Fellow of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and he has played a major role in our work. He is a member of our Board of Trustees, a chairman of our Academic Advisory Board. He's delivered several hundred lectures, we may be over hundreds by now, in our programs since he first joined our visiting faculty in 1995, when he was still a graduate student and his hair was not gray. He is also co-founder of the Imaginative Conservative, where he has played a role in publishing our first book that we came up with a couple of years ago, Russell Kirk's Prospects for Conservatives. He is an internationally known essayist on culture, politics, and conservatism, and the American founding, and is the author of several books, including Russell Kirk, American Conservative, for which last Saturday he received the Paolucci Book Award of the Year, which is a book award which annually honors the book that has been published in that year that has most moved forward the understanding of conservative principles. So it is my great pleasure to present to you my friend, Dr. Bradley Birzer.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am deeply honored to be up here, to come up after that gracious introduction. I love Texas. Some of you know me. I go on too long about how much I love Texas. But I do want to thank, obviously, Dr. Brand, as well as George and Bob. I was thinking maybe I'd go ahead and have George stand during my entire talk. I don't know if you'd want to do that, George, but please feel free. I also want to thank, of course, Steve Glugowitz, who's been a great friend, and Winston Elliott, with whom I have been an ally and friend. He's my best friend. It's going on 21 years now, and he's right. I was 27 at my first program, which is hard to think of. I didn't have any kids. I wasn't married. That's all changed in all kinds of ways, and you can see that age has, in some ways, well, maybe many ways, taken its toll. So I think about some important numbers, at least for me, as I'm thinking about what conservatism is. And I'd like us, as I titled this talk, Why We Conserve, I want us to think about why we believe in free enterprise. I loved what Bob said as he was thinking about what is law, what is order, how do we address one another, how do we think about dignity. And then, of course, we had Dr. Brand asking the most essential questions as well. Well, how do we honor one another in community? Where is friendship? What do we think about those things? So I think about the number 40. Here we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Free Enterprise Institute. I was 8 years old when this institute was founded, and I say that for a very important reason. Conservatism, as probably most of us in this room, along with libertarianism, was founded in 1953 by an extremely popular book, well-received book. He did not expect it, the author did not expect it to be so well-received. But this was Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind, which really gave voice to a whole generation of non-left-wing thinkers. Those people had been around for a while. Albert J. Nock during World War II. Friedrich Hayek very famously had written The Road to Serfdom. Ray Bradbury had written Fahrenheit 451, but it was really Dr. Kirk who put all of this together in his 1953 book. That book then became the main inspiration for Barry Goldwater. That then became the main inspiration for Ronald Reagan. So in the middle of all of that, think about 1976, and I can't help thinking back to when I was 8 and thinking about growing up, and I was hoping Bob didn't think I was checking my email. I was actually on maps trying to figure out exactly how far north I grew up from here. But I grew up 670 miles north of here in Hutchinson, Kansas. And I remember very well in 1976 that we were pretty ticked off. My mom was upset, my neighbors were upset, my town was upset. We thought Gerald Ford, regardless, not to get into politics too much, but we thought that by his excusing Nixon, there had been too many betrayals. We thought that by us getting out of Vietnam and Cambodia, there had been too many betrayals. It felt like a very, very dark time. And yet I also remember in my little neighborhood, all of us coming together, and we decided throughout my hometown that we would take the fire hydrants and we would paint them all as our favorite patriots from the American Revolution. And it was also, everyone in our neighborhood agreed that we would all start putting up copies of the Declaration in our home. So when I think about what Winston does here for the Free Enterprise Institute and the fact that it was founded in the bicentennial year, there's a very interesting moment of founding or refounding in the idea of, let us think about what we can serve. What are we doing here? And my image as an 8-year-old, and I'm sure we all have very different views of this, but my image as an 8-year-old of 1976 was, we're sick of what's happening in Washington. Even as an 8-year-old, I was aware of this. And what are we going to do? Well, of course, we return to first principles. We get out our World Book encyclopedias and we look at what Betsy Ross looked like and we make a fire hydrant based on her. And I realize, in the big scheme of things, that's pretty bizarre. And yet, it was wonderful. That has always stuck with me. And I also remember, because my family was so political, my mom was deeply involved in the Goldwater movement in the 60s. Never, I think to this day, she just turned 80. I think she's still upset Goldwater didn't win that election, and she thinks that was the end of American society. But regardless, I also remember, and I'm sure many of you do too, remember how utterly gracious Ronald Reagan was when he did not win the nomination. Remember that. They called him up on stage in Kansas City, and he praised the Republican Party. He praised Gerald Ford. And then, in a hint that I don't think anyone quite caught, he said the most important thing we need to do in the next decade is get rid of nuclear weapons. It's kind of out of the blue. And yet, that's amazing to think about that. And I don't think any of us, whatever we think of Reagan, and I would assume in this crowd, yeah, Reagan makes my heart sore, at least when I think about him. But he was always with dignity, always. In his arguments, in the way he treated his enemies. Think about how close of friends he became with Tip O'Neill. Now, all of that was Reagan. And I think we can look back to that year that Rollins Story created the Free Enterprise Institute. Winston has carried it on. And in so many ways, we carry on that legacy of what is liberty, what is dignity, what is honor, what is a constitution, what is order, what is justice. And we always know that no matter what, we have to go back to first principles. So those are good years, I think, to think about, and good numbers. 40 is a great number. Maybe we're over the hill now, but just barely. So what does that mean? I want to turn to one of my favorite writings from the American founding period, strangely enough written by an anti-federalist, but one who, of course, loved America as much as the Federalists, just had a different vision. He wrote, "We do not by declarations change the nature of things or create new truths, but we give existence, or at least establish in the minds of our people, truths and principles which they might never have thought of or have soon forgotten. If a republic means its systems, religious or political, shall have any duration, it ought to recognize the leading principles of them in the front page of every family book." Now, we were all blessed with a number of things this morning, but one was Bob McNair's Pocket Constitution that Winston and Steve put together. Did you have a chance to look at it? Is this not exactly what the Anti-Federalists told us to do? That we have to have a reminder all the time of first principles. And this is what we have done. And I can say, not to be too autobiographical here, but from the moment I met Winston in 1995 to this point in 2016, my career has been intimately shaped by the Free Enterprise Institute. There's no way I would have gotten that book award last week without the encouragement of Winston or the support of what's going on here. And I say this because obviously I'm not alone. You have a U.S. Senator who went through this program. You have a very famous professor, John Majewski, at the University of California. There are people everywhere. Brittany Baldwin you've seen before. But every time I go to a public meeting, when I go and I meet with other conservatives or libertarians, I always get the same thing now. You're Brad Birzer. You co-founded the Imaginative Conservative with Winston Elliott. What's Winston like? And I'm not exaggerating. It's amazing how many people have done this. And I think in the 6 years that Steve and Winston and I, to a certain extent, but they really get the credit, think about what they've done to drive this website, the fact that we now have 10,000 people a day reading this website that Winston created 6 years ago. There's a whole school of thought. And yet, what is that school of thought? For those of you who've had a chance to go on that site, you know that it has economics, it has arguments on history and natural rights, but also, as we saw with Dr. Brand, we have great discussions on Socrates. Why does Socrates matter? Why does Cicero matter? How do they figure into this great tradition? So I think when we look at this anti-federalist writer saying we need to remember first principles all the time, this is what Winston and Steve do at the Free Enterprise Institute. They are constantly reminding us about what is good, what is true, what is necessary, and what we must pursue. And I also think about the kind of community they form, the association, the bringing together of all these people of goodwill, because we desire, I think as Bob said beautifully, we desire, even in the great problems of today, to think about what is order, what is principle, how do we treat someone with dignity when we know they have a grievance? Or as Professor Brand said so very well, yes, that football player has every right to protest. We also have every right to criticize him for protesting. That's part of freedom. And it's a necessary thing that we can't just give one without the other. We have to have that balance and proportion. So I wanted to make 3 points this morning, and I promise not to keep you too long. I realize everybody has work. You probably have missed Houston traffic now, right, for the most part, so that's good. But let me give you 3 points that I think are very important to understand about what it means to conserve and why conservatism almost always is related to the idea of foundings, thinking about, in particular, the founding of the Free Enterprise Institute 4 decades ago. I have the great blessing of teaching every fall Western civilization, the great ideas. It's too fast, it's too much in one civilization, one semester, but I think it introduces our students at Hillsdale to a whole range of great thoughts. So we start with Genesis, we talk about its meaning, and then we go into the Greeks, and then to the Romans, and then we end up with the English medievals, looking at this narrative based on Dr. Kirk's book, The Roots of American Order. But in doing so, as we think about the Jewish contribution as well as the Greek contribution to Western civilization, I always argue, and I think Dr. Brand would probably agree with me at least at some level, maybe more symbolic than actual, but that when we look to the actual founding of Western civilization, that is, a founding, what is it that we're trying to conserve? We can look to this little battle that only had 300 good guys in it, and they weren't the greatest guys. They were actually coming from a dual monarchy. They had a society that was not something I think we as Americans would be that comfortable with, their place called Sparta, but they believed so strongly in living for honor. And no matter what differences the Athenians and the Spartans may have had, they both recognized that Persia was wrong because Persia had a god king, and no man has the right to also be God. This is not permissible in any way. We also know that the Persians were deeply offended by the Greeks in the fact they didn't have a god king. And they were upset that these 150 city-states, what we call a polis, were able to rule themselves without centralized authority and a god king. And so we end up with this fascinating war, the Persian-Greek wars, in which the Persian wars, we find that the Persians invade Greece several times. But for me, and partly because of the Texas connection, thinking about what happened at the Alamo with the defense there of 187 Tennesseans and Tejanos against 5,000 battle-hardened Mexicans, I also think about Thermopylae. And I think about what happened at this Gates of Fire in 480, where only 300 Spartans held off 100,000 Persians. Now, just think about that for a moment. 300 against 100,000 Persians. Now, 187 here against 5,000 for about the same duration of time. And of course, it's not an accident that when you walk to the Alamo, it says on the front, not only the Texas Shrine of Liberty, but the Thermopylae of the West. It's pretty accurate. So let me just read to you from one of the great thinkers of the ancient world, Herodotus, the first historian, as he describes this battle. But Xerxes, who was the god king of Persia, but Xerxes was not persuaded any the more. 4 whole days he suffered to go by, expecting that the Greeks would run away. When, however, he found that on the 5th that they were not gone, he thought their firm stand was impudence and recklessness, and he grew wroth. And he sent his best troops against them with orders to bring these Spartans alive so that he could interrogate them in his presence. His best troops rushed forward and charged the Spartans, but they fell in vast numbers. Others now took the places of the slain and would not be beaten off, though they suffered terrible losses. In this way it became clear to all, but especially to the god king, that though he had plenty of soldiers, he had only a few men. Now imagine that recognition of this, and what a powerful statement. And I always tell my students, the moment the last Spartan died, Western civilization was born. And I believe that firmly. Why? Because as Winston has said, as Steve has said, as the free enterprise system has said, and as the founding fathers said, there is no liberty without sacrifice. There can never be order or freedom without the honoring of those who came before us and a recognition that real work is work, that we have to work, that we have to, through prudential judgment, understand what it is that we inherit and what it is that we pass on. This is never an easy task. And so I would also ask for you to remember, and we'll jump forward just a little bit, the American founding. How many of us wonder why so many of the founders use pseudonyms based on the Romans? Why do we call the U.S. Senate the Senate? Why do we use a Latin term for that? Why do we have a res publica, a republic? Why is the U.S. Capitol building designed after a 2nd century BC Roman building? Why? Because our founders, when they founded America, founded it firm on the ancient tradition of antiquity. And they saw themselves as new Romans. They saw themselves as establishing something that had already existed, but had not existed for thousands of years. And for us today, to go around and maybe we talk about utopia, whether it's a kind of libertarian utopia or a socialist utopia, most people would laugh at us. But for someone like George Washington or John Dickinson or Thomas Jefferson to walk around in 1775 and say, we're going to establish a republic, that was as airy as it would sound now if I said, we're going to have a utopia. Republics were crazy. They were unstable. They hadn't been tried for thousands of years. And yet the founders believed very, very firmly in what they were doing. And I think about this issue. Imagine Thermopylae. We'll take that forward a little bit. How does the American Revolution start? There are ideas flowing starting in 1760. What does it mean to believe in natural rights, free enterprise? On the other side of the Atlantic, of course, we have Adam Smith writing and Edmund Burke, David Hume, great proponents of liberty and order. But on this side of the Atlantic, we also have people who are trying to figure out what this means. And I would ask us, again, just to imagine, standing with 40 men at 4:20 in the morning on April 19th of 1775 in Lexington, Massachusetts. 40 men, knowing that 6,600 British soldiers were en route to their position. What are they going to do? How are they going to stop them? How are they going to delegate? How are they going to show what they believe in? How are they going to demonstrate? And of course, they do. And that begins the war. No matter how great the ideas are, it was this little green in Massachusetts where the war started because people started firing at one another. And yet, why? Because these men in Lexington believed they had a duty to defend their res publica, to defend their little republic. I would ask you to think about the words for a moment of John Dickinson, one of the most forgotten and yet one of the greatest of the American founding fathers. He writes in his 1768 Letters of a Pennsylvania Farmer, he says, "Let us, with a truly wise generosity and charity, banish and discourage all illiberal distinctions, which may arise from differences in situation, forms of government, or modes of religion. Let us consider ourselves men, free men, separated from the rest of the world, but firmly bound together by the same interests, objects, rights, and dangers. Let us keep our attention inflexibly fixed on the great objects of life which we must continuously regard in order to preserve our rights, to promote our interests, and to avert the dangers of this world. Let the truths be indelibly impressed on our minds that we cannot be happy without being free, that we cannot be free without being secure in our property, and that we cannot be secure in our property if without our consent others may, as they claim by right, take it away. But I remind you most of all, let us take care of our rights, and then we will have our prosperity taken care of. For slavery never occurs unless we have fallen asleep. Now that's powerful. Slavery never occurs unless we've fallen asleep. So again, let's jump forward. 1953, the founding of conservatism in the modern world. 1976, the founding of the Free Enterprise Institute. I don't think it's a real stretch to go from one to the other, because it's very clear to me that Texas as a whole is the guardian of Western civilization in 2016. I have no doubt about that. I feel that every time I cross the border, I feel every time I come to this great Republic of Texas. This is the place. And it doesn't surprise me that there's a Winston Elliott here, or a Steve Klugowitz, or a Bob McNair, or a George Strait. It makes sense to me, because I know the Texas character. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I'm married to a Texan. I'm very proud of that. She's very proud of that. She lets me remember quite often. She's very proud of that. So let me end with this. I think what John Dickinson said was absolutely right. We have to be awake. Every day, every year, every generation, we can lose our rights. And we do this quite often because we focus on one truth at the expense of thousands of others. We do this because we exaggerate one good thing at the expense of so many others. We become wrapped up in the immediate. We become wrapped up in the situation. And again, I admire what Bob said so much. When we think about very complex issues of civil rights, of civil liberties, we also have to remember there's a long history to this. This is not a momentary thing. It is a momentary expression of timeless frustrations, ones that take a very, very long time and lots of hard work to work out. But I also agree with Herodotus that we should be men. I believe that it's very important that we stand up for what we believe, that we state the truth. In fact, I would argue very forcefully that for us to be conservative and to fudge the truth because we're uncomfortable in a situation means we're not only harming ourselves, we're harming the person we're talking to, even someone we disagree with. It is respect to actually tell somebody what you think about them. Now, maybe you have to say it properly, but you still have to say it. It's not respectful when we hide the truth because we may allow the feelings of the person to be saved, but we're harming the soul, and we're harming our soul as well. We have to have that dignity. We have to be able to stand for those things. And I also agree with the anti-federalist. We should never forget the most important truths. We should remember them all the time, whether it's printing our pocket constitution or starting this meeting with a prayer and an invocation and a pledge and a song. Amen. It's what we should be doing. It's what everybody should be doing. It's not tyranny. It's not oppression. It's a reminder of what is necessary. So, why do we conserve? We conserve because we know there are things worth conserving. One of my favorite quotes from the great Athenian general Pericles was that we love our fathers because they loved their fathers. Now, that could just be an easy saying, but it's not. We love our fathers because they loved their fathers. We honor those traditions. We believe very strongly in Cicero. We believe very strongly in Socrates and Aristotle. We believe very strongly in George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. We believe strongly in Eva Braun. These are great things. We need freedom. We need security. We need justice. And we need order. And we have to work for this all the time. It's a job that never ends. So let me finish with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite people, a man who I think probably will never be topped in the American experience, our first president, George Washington. At the end of his address to Congress in 1789, he said, "I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than this, that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity, since we ought not to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a people that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven herself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of republicanism are justly considered, perhaps deeply, perhaps finely, now staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. It's George Washington. Now imagine that, what he's saying. We have been given a republic. Our republic is deeply ancient, and yet our republic is absolutely modern. How do we live that out? We will only live it out when we find that balance between order and liberty, between right and duty, when we find that there is proportion, when we find that we must pursue what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And so I can speak from personal example, but I can also speak from empirical example, just looking out here. This is what the Free Enterprise Institute does. We work hard, we promote things that we believe are absolutely true, and frankly, if you look at the statistics that we have in the book, we've done really, really well. Happy 40th. Thank you.